Okay, hi everybody. The voice that you can hear is not my voice. Obviously, it's the voice of the interpreters. If you do wish to contact me afterwards with questions, I do welcome that. So in the UK, we have a deaf population of around 87,000. So around, if we take that into consideration and dementia, about 1,000 of that figure experience dementia. So if we think about the deaf community and their language use, deaf people grow up using sign language. As you've said, that my research is a 9-year journey. Deaf people experience barriers every single day. And then we double that for deaf people living with dementia, particularly around diagnostic, their journey, their support package, access to information online in their first preferred language. My colleagues here today have presented some wonderful information around accessible websites. But if we take into consideration the sign language population, they're unable to access that resource because it's not in their first language. So my research holds great importance to ensuring that deaf people have a voice. So I was involved in a wider study which was funded by the ESRC and IHR, and it was a neighbourhood project with 7 work programmes. So we wanted to look at actually what does neighbourhood, the concept of neighbourhoods mean for deaf sign language users and their carers living with dementia. And I'm going to explore that further with you today. So from that, the concept of neighbourhoods, we wanted to look at and give people the opportunity to build life story work. We've taken some culturally appropriate resources and explored this with the sign language population, demonstrating that deaf people have their own history. So I'll explain that also. So just allow me to introduce to you the project aims and designs. Initially, we wanted to look at storytelling and to ascertain why that's important to the deaf community and what the values are behind that. And what does cultural specifications and design requirements for deaf people with dementia? We needed to do a test activity to test whether these resources would be successful or not. So firstly, I wanted to explore what does it mean for me as a deaf person living in a hearing world. I'll just give you some personal examples that will really highlight this issue. We've got 2 things. So in 2016, I very proudly achieved a PhD. People still ask me, in this day, who wrote my thesis? They automatically think it was my interpreter. I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning, sweating, writing that thesis. It wasn't my interpreter, I can assure you. But people do make the assumption that because I am deaf and I use sign language, that I'm unable to create a research project or thesis on my own. I know at the end of a presentation, and this has happened many a time, people will come up to me after my presentation and say, "Oh my God, your interpreter is amazing." They glorify the interpreter, but not actually look at me and say, "It's me, it's my presentation, it's not the interpreter," but we do work well together. So this is just an example of everyday barriers, everyday stigma, how the community and society label me or disadvantage me. But then you think about the deaf population and people living with dementia and how they're marginalised, double, triple, if not more. So geographically, deaf people are dispersed. So when we think about neighbourhood and under the lens of a neighbourhood, what does that look like? How can we support a culturally minority population that are so geographically dispersed? But again, deaf people have small clusters of communities, but it's not just communities, it's more of a global. So if you think about the context of other countries, deaf people get together. They get together regardless of where they're from, regardless of where their roots are. But then they find roots with each other, that feeling of sameness. I'm from Ireland, you're from the Netherlands. But we have that lived experience. We share the commonality of feeling marginalised every day the moment we walk out the front door. So talking about deaf cultural norms, I'll share with you some tips. If you ever want to get my attention, flash the lights. You know, technology, unfortunately, let us down on this because now there's no switches. There's all these electronic sensors type things that work for us now. But deaf people are very tactile. They like sound, like vibrations if you bang something. So these are just tips that actually visual clues that deaf people need. But this is also applicable to people living with dementia and their deafness, because actually their function and cognitive function changes, but we need to constantly think about how we can have strategies to be able to still maintain their dignity, their communication, and their cultural norms. So you can see that I'm pausing, but then you can still hear that of the interpreters. The voice of the interpreter, because actually what the interpreter is doing is translating between two languages. I stop and actually let the interpreter breathe because she finds it difficult to speak so fast. So that's why sometimes you hear the voice, but I've stopped signing. We share the same history. All of us here have experience and lived experience. We have those historical markers that we all align to. But deaf people have their own historical events, their own history markers. So, for example, in Manchester, I obviously from the UK, and there was a gentleman that shared his experience of World War II. He was appointed a role as a firefighter because everyone was away at war. He was given this responsibility and he felt he was the same as other people. He felt on par with his hearing friends. Soon as the war ended, his volunteer role was taken away, everybody came back, and that role was taken from him. He felt redundant. He felt unneeded. Those memories of him feeling powerful, feeling empowered was important for him. Hearing people wouldn't be aware of that. People that aren't deaf will not understand the positioning of that person. Being given that responsibility was of importance to that individual. So storytelling is a lifelong practice globally for deaf people. Deaf people come together and share stories. What it does is reinforces deafness, it reinforces pride, it reinforces identity, it scaffolds, it reignites that I'm okay, that I'm living, but I'm facing barriers, but like you and me, we share that commonality, that sameness. So we're recharged, we're out there every day facing those barriers, but we've got our armour on because we've had that exposure with other people that share those experiences. What it means is that we share with you our history, and that's important. And it's important for a number of reasons, because I want my carer to understand who I am and see me. So things like strategies like singing for the brain doesn't help deaf people. I'm not interested in music, but let's think about what is more culturally appropriate to the deaf community. I want to talk about being a firefighter in World War II and giving that responsibility, but not being stigmatized by my carers to say, you, a firefighter, never. I want to be able to share my history, and that's how we do that through life story work, is giving that person an opportunity to share who they are and be more visible. Right, so deaf carers. So we worked with deaf carers and their family member living with dementia. And we wanted to explore, yes, growing up as sign language users, but what are our strategies to ensure that person is scaffolded? So we came up with some strategies. So waiting for that person to acknowledge the conversation. Touch, eye gaze, embodying, not saying, excuse me, can I come in, or excuse me, I'm here, but being very visible, being really engaging, performing helps that person live with dementia engage and converse. Eye gaze in sign language globally is very important. So when we're thinking about strategies for communication for someone living with dementia, pointing is another way of referencing communication. The frame of reference has gone, and that's because of dementia. So we're trying to expand that and then frame what the conversation is about in a clear way, in a visual way that enables that person to still engage in the topic. As you know, language evolves globally. New signs are being developed, new words are being developed, sign language is ever changing. So if I'm meeting someone living with dementia, they still might use old signs. Before, my colleague mentioned about the old style radio, which I thought was really lovely. Our signs evolve with technology. So the sign for radio will refer to a button being turned, but that's no longer applicable now. But when we're meeting or conversing with a deaf person living with dementia, you would never correct that. You would always appreciate and understand and adopt their signs and reflect that through conversation. One of our co-producers and a participant I worked with explained a story about working with an interpreter and working with a occupational therapist. So the interpreter did their job, they translated in sign language, but the carer knew that their mother wouldn't understand that translation, which is a very abstract way of explaining. So what the carer did was physically stood up, said, "Mum, you get your leg like this, and you get your other leg, and you stretch it out." So she really embodied, and then Mum was able to copy. So the way the instructions were given needs to be really empowering and really accessible. So it's not just about bringing in an interpreter, but it is really thinking about the needs of that person living with dementia. So I conducted interviews, 2-stage interviews with 3 families, and I just want to share with you some examples. So we had a father and son. Stan and Mark didn't get on very well, both deaf, so they'd really battling every day with communication and their relationship. So I came in as a researcher and asked them to think about their family history and share photos. And Stan had some lovely stories to tell. And Mark was overwhelmed because he had his father back. He no longer saw the dementia. They actually saw, "I remember my dad, I remember who you are," and it reunited their relationship. But that happened because of the photographs. They had their identity back. Stan found his voice and was able to share some of his experiences. So then we wanted to explore emotional scaffolding and reaffirming that couplehood. So I met with Leslie and Rowan. They've been together. They're a lesbian couple, never got married, but been together for centuries. And they looked at pictures from a holiday that happened many, many moons ago. And then Rowan was saying, "I remember trying to propose to you, and it just went downhill. We were on a beach, it was too dark, I was on one knee, I was trying to sign to you, and all you could say was, what you doing down there? Stand up." And I just bottled it, I got too nervous. So this channel opened because they had the opportunity to really reposition themselves as a couple that needed that reinforcement that actually it's okay for us to be together. Because of dementia, do you not want to be with me? Do you still see me as your partner, your loved one? So that narrative was really positive because it rebonded, it reinforced that couplehood. So hopefully that will maintain. And then we have Verity, Harry and Miranda. Verity lived in a care home. And I turned up with my camera all ready to go. And Verity was sat in the lounge. And she was sat there with a tambourine in her hand. Yeah, music was playing. Everyone was enjoying herself. And she sat there. If you look at me, you can see the body language that she was showing. And she saw me and I waved at her. Straight away, she knew I was deaf. I didn't sign. I didn't acknowledge that. She went, "Are you deaf?" I said, "Yes." She dropped the tambourine and she walked over and she took me to have this discussion. It was that, a deaf person in a sea of non-deaf people, she was able to spot me from a mile off, and she had that sense of, I want to be able to communicate and I can communicate with you. Those channels were open. So we sat down and got the photo album out. Her verbal communication had reduced, but what she did have was 2 pointed fingers that were very powerful. So she opened up a photograph and was looking at different images and faces in the pictures. She couldn't remember names. In the sea of faces, she was able to identify who was deaf and who was hearing. She was able to say, I remember that person, but what I remember about them is not their name, it's the fact that they were deaf or hearing, that I could communicate with them. And Harry and Miranda were just absolutely overwhelmed with Mum's sort of way of communicating. And she kept her finger down despite for us to try and move her on from this particular picture. So Verity had the power. She was able to control this dialogue. She was able to control, she felt empowered to say, no, I'm not moving from this picture. I'm quite enjoying looking at some old memories. And I felt really good that she was able to find that empowerment from somewhere to enable that discussion to take place. So my conclusion is life story work is successful. Storytelling is successful. It reaffirms identity. It celebrates identity in a big population, but being the minority, it gives people a voice, an opportunity to share their heritage. Deaf people have natural ability, natural strategies that work, but they can be transferable to people that are hearing or non-deaf people living with dementia. If their speech declines, their hearing declines, these strategies that deaf people have innately can be shared. So it could be a match made in heaven. For me, life story work existed throughout my childhood. It's part of who we are as a deaf community. It shouldn't be any different. I can maintain this despite a diagnosis. I can still maintain the positiveness and the way that gives me a new lease of life. When I was talking to Leslie, just going back to the couple, at one point I had to stop the interview and she said to me, I really thank you for coming. I've seen you twice now, but I need to clarify, what is dementia? My partner's been living with dementia for 5 years. 5 years, and no one had ever explained in sign language what dementia meant for them as a couple living with dementia and the impact. So these carers out there that don't have access to enough information, they don't have access to support, they don't know what it is, they don't know how to support their loved one the best way possible. So there's still continuing barriers, which then limits the life story work that we can do, because people need to be informed to be able to build on that information to then make sure that they're able to support appropriately and adaptations for culturally appropriate things. So we've got publications. Always say thank you to participants. Without them, I wouldn't be up here signing to such a great audience. So thank you for them and thank you for watching.